So good evening. I'm Graham Allison, the director of the Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs, and it's my great privilege to welcome back to Harvard, back home to the Belfer Center and to the Kennedy School, Michèle Flournoy. Michèle is the chief executive currently of one of our competitors, and one of the most impressive competitors in Washington, the Center for the New American Security, which actually was created, founded by Michèle and Kurt Campbell, another former Belfer Kennedy School person. So we're very proud of both of them, and especially of Michèle. So Michèle's career is, I think, a good place to start, that I'll say just an extra word or two about, because a very good question for students in the school is, what kind of a career is that, or how does one follow such an unusual path? So she was a student at Harvard College, so much for the undergraduates in social studies. She went to Oxford, to Balliol, where she got a master's in international relations. She came back fascinated by the problem of arms control. As we were chatting earlier, if we didn't solve that problem, there wouldn't be any other problems to work on. So, and had started thinking about that. She came to the Belfer Center in 1990 and was there for 3 years as a fellow through 93, where she coordinated a project that Joe Nye and Al Carnesale and I were the three musketeers on, called Avoiding Nuclear War. She's then been rotating in and out of government, where she was at the Defense Department in the Clinton administration. She was then out of government for a time, and mainly in think tanks, or founding a think tank. She was back into the Obama administration in the first term as the Undersecretary for Policy at the Defense Department. And she had a little bit of a stint at Boston Consulting Group, but mostly this has been a career driven by policy issues. So Michèle, if we could start, just what kind of a career is that, and should other students think of a path like that?
Yeah. Well, first of all, it's wonderful to be back home here at the Kennedy School and at Harvard. And thank you, Graham, for your mentorship over the years and for welcoming me back. You know, I think the one thing I would say to an audience like this, particularly the students, is there are a lot of ways to do public service. There's the obvious ways of serving a government or serving your country. But there are also ways in the nonprofit sector and in academia and outside where you can also do public service. And one of the pieces of advice I got early in my career is that even if you're going to have multiple stints in government, unless you're going to be a career civil servant, you're probably still going to spend more time outside than in. So find a base that you're passionate about and a way to contribute from that base. And for me, that was always the think tank world, which really serves as both an ideas incubator for people in government and also a talent incubator for government.
So let me drill down just one more on this one. So you not only have lived in think tanks and written papers in think tanks, written books in think tanks, here at Belfer, at the Arms Control Association and otherwise, but you're a more unusual character than that, in that I would say you've engaged in entrepreneurship in institution building. So there's now a think tank in Washington called the Center for the New American Security, which has a bunch of people working there, doing good work. That wouldn't be there, that wasn't there before you and Kurt decided to do this, and wouldn't be there if you weren't its chief executive. So tell us, what about that part of the career?
Yeah. Well, Kurt and I had this crazy idea that Washington really needed another think tank. But we had an idea for how to do it differently. First, we wanted to take an approach to bipartisanship that sort of took the gloves off, meaning don't be so careful that we don't take on the controversial issues because we're worried about offending each other. Rather, create a safe space where folks from across the political spectrum and both the civil and military communities can come together, take the intellectual gloves off, and really have at it on the tough issues. But we also were very seized by this idea that think tanks not only provide ideas to the government, Kissinger, in one of his memoirs, talks about packing his intellectual suitcase, and we help pack that intellectual suitcase for policymakers. But they also grow the talent, and we really wanted to make part of our mission growing the next generation of national security leaders. And I think some of our greatest impact has been actually launching dozens and dozens of young people into government service.
Okay, but the activity of trying to entrepreneur and create and nurture and build is a little different than what you were doing before. So say a word about that, and is that again something students should be thinking about as some part?
I mean, the fun part of it is you got to design this organization as you thought it should be, down to thinking through aspects of the culture and the incentive structure and what was going to make it a great place to work. The hard part is nobody had ever heard of us. You know, CNAS, how do you say that? Is it CNAS? Is it CNAS? Why Center for a New American Security? I mean, you know, nobody knew who we are. You had to establish credibility through the people that you got involved, through the work that you were able to do. And the hardest piece is fundraising in a very, very crowded field. Over time, that's gotten easier and easier as we've shown our value and we've demonstrated the sort of unique niche that we occupy. But it takes, you have to be willing to take risk. I mean, everybody told us, do not do this. You are crazy. Why are you jeopardizing a perfectly safe career path? And fortunately, 2 people told us to take the jump. One was our first chairman, Bill Perry, and the other was our first funder, who was willing to write a check. So we were able to take the jump, take the leap.
And CNAS is just about to celebrate its 10th birthday.
Yes,
so
it is.
I would say that's an impressive achievement. So we're going to jump around a little bit, both in terms of policy issues and in terms of management issues, since Michèle has been engaged in both. But why don't we start with Syria, which is the headache, the headache of headaches. So the Post had a pretty good story, I thought, the day before yesterday on the current state of affairs and the discussion that's going on. I mean, Michèle, as Undersecretary for Policy, went to how many hundred of deputies? More than you would like to count.
Yeah.
But an endless number of meetings at the White House where one sits around and says, this is an impossible problem, let's admire it for a little bit, and after admiring it, then what to do, and so options arise, and there's a debate about them. So that's a debate that's going on now, at least according to the Post story, about more substantially arming the moderate Syrian opposition. But in the course of this, of the newspaper story, this was by, I don't have by who it was the day before yesterday. Quote, one senior U.S. official said that it's time for a ruthless look at whether CIA-supported fighters can still be considered moderate, and whether the program can accomplish anything beyond adding to the carnage in Syria. The CIA-supported units, according to this official quote, are not doing any better on the battlefield. They're up against a more formidable adversary, and they're increasingly dominated by extremists, close quote. So what about that?
So let me start by saying I think that there are no good options in Syria anymore. I don't know if there were ever any good options, but the options have gotten narrower and worse over time, which tends to happen as civil wars become protracted. I think it's important that we step back and think about, what are our core interests here? And I would say, first of all, to prevent the so-called Islamic State from getting, really having a safe haven, establishing a caliphate from which they can launch attacks on us and our allies and our interests. 2, preventing the spillover of the instability in Syria to destabilize important allies and partners on the periphery. And 3, dealing with the humanitarian crisis, the worst refugee problem that we have seen since World War II, and the ongoing carnage there. But I'm one who believes that this Syria situation, neither side can win on the battlefield. this is going to have to be a negotiated outcome. The question is, how do you set the conditions for that negotiation to be fruitful? I think, John Kerry has been tireless in trying to negotiate at least a ceasefire, if not the beginnings of resolution. The problem is the conditions on the ground have not supported his success because Assad, and backed by the Russians and the Iranians, think they're winning, and they think they can win on the battlefield. So the question is, how do you change those conditions? The primary answer to that question so far has been trying to find opposition groups we could work with and then providing them with arms and supplies. And I personally was someone who was supportive of doing more in that regard in the past. The challenge I see is this is now unfolding so rapidly. In 2 months, if Aleppo falls and the opposition groups in that area are wiped out, or they could be pushed north into an enclave that is dominated by Al-Qaeda affiliated groups. So the question of how much of a moderate opposition will still even exist 2 months from now is an open question, meaning will the US have partners beyond the ones we've already established in the south and then along the border with Turkey? Who will be there to work with? That is an open question that the next administration will have to wrestle with.
So again, let me just stay with this for one more round. So in the final debate, Secretary Clinton said she still supports carving out an area in northern Syria for civilians and moderate opposition, elements where Syrian and Russian planes wouldn't be allowed to fly. Quote, a no-fly zone can save lives and hasten the end of the conflict, the Secretary said, adding that doing so would take a lot of negotiations. It would also make it clear to the Russians and Syrians that our purpose here was humanitarian safe zones. And then in one of the other emails, she said, of course, this would involve killing a lot of people.
Is there a question?
What about that? So if we were doing it today, not, again, hypothetically, what about, again, the conditions may be different or so different, but if we were doing it today, just so we can get our coordinates.
So there are areas in the south along the border with Jordan and in the north along the border with Turkey where forces that we have supported do control territory, and those could be built upon to become safe zones. Whether you could extend those further into eastern Syria is going to be an open question depending on how things evolve on the ground. Again, I think there's the humanitarian objective. There's also this more fundamental objective of can you set the conditions for Assad and the Russians and Iran to actually come to the table more productively. But I think the devil is in the details. It's going to take really looking at the geography, where it is at that point in time, what groups are still viable, what is the posture of the Russians vis-a-vis the regime and our ability to try to deter the Assad regime without directly getting into conflict with the Russian military.
Okay. So
A
let me
very
take
complicated problem, like I said, no good or easy options.
One of the things to underline, especially for students, is Michèle simplifies things as much as possible, but always reminds you of the additional layers of complexity.
Yeah, sorry to be
So,
difficult, but
no,
no
I
easy
would
answers.
say that's realistic
Right.
for my nickel. Let me jump you to another topic, defense budgets. So if we look at the programs and promises, they cost about twice as much as we have money. So the question is always, how can you stuff this much stuff into this size of a bag? So each year we do this by proposing that modernization of nuclear program. That's mañana, okay? Then the buy, well, it'll be later. And so if you look at it, I think the imbalance is obvious to see. That is driven to a significant extent by everybody playing let's pretend. But if you think about it realistically, suppose we have only $600 or $650 billion for defense, and we have the programs and promises we have today.
Yeah.
So what to do? Yeah.
So I think there are two really important early priorities that I hope whoever is the next president will take. One is to reach out to Congress and try to get a 4-year budget deal as a national security issue. Part of the problem is that the Defense Department has not had a predictable budget top line. For a long time, they've been living from continuing resolution to continuing resolution, the threat of sequestration hanging over their heads, but it's also allowed people to sort of sit back and say, well, I'm just going to keep all, this 10-pound bag of stuff, and I'm going to try to fit it in the 5-pound bag, because at some point, all this nightmare is going to be over, and my budget's going to go up, and I'll be able to pay for everything. And so there's been no, ironically, the discipline has not been forced in the system. So getting a budget deal that sort of sets the parameters under which you have to make choices is the first thing. The second is I believe that one of the key challenges over the next 15 years is maintaining something that's always been an advantage for the United States military, or long been an advantage, and that is our military technological edge. We have always been able to have that edge, and it's enabled us to prevail in many situations. That is no longer a given, because many of the technologies that we rely on are becoming ubiquitous, and because of the role of commercial technologies that will have military applications that are available to others. So the next 10 to 15 years of investment will be critical, which means we have to make choices. And I would say the program we have today, in terms of everything that's on the books, if you were to say, is that the program you're going to need 10 to 15 years from now to make sure you have that edge, the answer is almost certainly no. So the question is, again, making those trade-offs, which will require a lot of hard decisions in the coming administration.
Well, some of those the CNAS has produced reports on.
Yes.
And again,
not taking an institutional position, but
as a director,
elevating the debate.
As a director of an analogous center,
Yeah.
I certainly don't agree with all of the reports that come out from the Belfer Center, so you're not responsible for every report. But if I look at the one recently on basically the competition between China and the U.S. in the South China Sea, it notes the asymmetry of trying to build and deploy missiles on my homeland against adjacent seas as compared to the cost of a carrier trying to cope with those. So tell us about that trade-off as you think about the defense budget.
Sure. So I think that the overarching challenge that the United States will face from nation-state actors in the future is going to be an attempt to deny our access into regions when we try to project power to protect our allies or our interests, and to sort of undermine our ability to gain air superiority, gain maritime superiority, and operate freely. And so big platforms like carriers will be big targets. We will, in some areas, be outnumbered in terms of number of tactical aircraft that can be brought to bear because we're playing far away from our shores and somebody else will be playing, close to their shores. So we really have to think about asymmetric measures that can counter a number of these challenges. And it's not just smart investment in technology. It's really changing, our concepts of operations. And I'll give you an example. If you have, one of the things that China has done is it's massed huge missile arsenals to barrage, whether it's Taiwan or, an adversary, what have you. If you try to counter those with defensive interceptors, the calculus will never favor the defense. It will always favor the offense. However, if we were able to create a directed energy system or a system that used, that was something like a railgun on a carrier, then suddenly you're able to fire off faster, cheaper defensive weapons than they can fire offensively. It changes the whole calculation. That's probably a little more detail than you wanted, but it's an example where a technology can actually fundamentally change the cost-benefit analysis for an adversary and hopefully deter them from taking a particular action.
So I think that's a great example, and certainly it then is at least the rationale for the so-called third offset that
Right.
Bob Worth, who used to work with you at
Yeah.
CNAS, is the Deputy Secretary of Defense, who was here about a month ago when we were discussing this. But in a world in which technologies are changing rapidly, and in which the commercial part of the world is moving much more rapidly than any governmental unit can do, if I ask myself in other arenas about Chinese technology, so let's say, for example, I want to buy a drone just as a person. So I go look at the market. Who's the dominant supplier of drones? A Chinese company. How good are the drones? Better than the American ones. Why not? They can produce drones, okay? So they obviously thought of the same idea. Why shouldn't I asymmetrically think of technological advantages relative to you? And unless you're going to have a defense budget that's way larger than your competitors, which we have had, or you're going to be a lot smarter, or you've got a different technological base. So if the technological base has, as you said, become substantially international and commercial, that I get the idea, but I'm not sure it's a long-term winning strategy.
Well, first of all, let me emphasize, the name of the game, is not to go to war with China or Russia. The name of the game is to deter the war from happening by being convincing that if you had to go to war, you would prevail, and it's not worth their effort. But secondly, I think, you may have situations where you have technological parity, although I think that's less likely than what you suggest. In the commercial domain, yes, but there are a lot of exquisite technologies that still, where I think we will have an edge. The second piece, though, the more important piece, is how you actually use those, how well they're integrated, how they're actually used, how dynamically they're controlled. And here's where the US military has an advantage, in that we really train people to have a lot of, to be thinking, to be adaptive in the middle of a situation, to be agile. And I think the human component should not be underestimated. And which isn't to say we don't have a clear command and control system, but we also train people to work their way through problems and to adapt and to adjust in a way that I think is hard for a lot of other militaries that may come out of more authoritarian systems.
I think it's extremely, extremely good point, and very hard to replicate. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So we were talking earlier about Norm Augustine, and his laws. Mm-hmm. This is a former chief executive of one of the airplane supply companies, Lockheed Martin, and who then became a sort of a wise curmudgeon. But in any case, Norm thinks of laws. One of his laws that he enunciated in 1983 says that by 2054, so this is, we will be able to afford only one aircraft. In the year 2054, the entire defense budget will purchase just one aircraft. This aircraft will have to be shared by the Air Force and the Navy, 3.5 days each per week, except in the leap year, okay, when the Marines get it. And there'll be only one pilot. So somebody has actually looked at the graph since 1984, and we're right on it.
Right.
So are we going to, in the lifetime at least of some of the students here be down to one aircraft or one
Right.
ship?
I think what he was getting at is that the costs associated with personnel, the costs associated with the DoD enterprise, are growing at such a rate that eventually they're going to squeeze, well, they already are, but they're going to really squeeze more and more the investment accounts and your ability to actually acquire and field capabilities. And so I do think that part of the agenda has to be a more aggressive approach to defense reform. Whether that is right-sizing our defense infrastructure. This is a very third-rail political issue on Capitol Hill, but right now you have all of the military service chiefs up on Capitol Hill saying they are carrying 25 to 30% of infrastructure that they do not need. And
So that
they
means
are
basically bases.
bases and facilities. So they are begging for permission to downsize. That's that translates into constituents, jobs. It's a very tough political thing to do. We have done it in the past, but it takes a lot from Congress, a real partnership with Congress to get that done. Secondly, healthcare costs. So like the rest of America, the military personnel, their families are experiencing growth in healthcare costs. And DoD healthcare, though, is compared to the VA or CMS or certainly the civilian part of the healthcare system, costs are growing even faster in the military system than elsewhere. In the past, DoD has tried to suggest that maybe we need to curtail costs by asking service members and their families to pay more because they tend to pay less. And you can imagine that goes over like a big lead balloon. Nobody wants to ask people who've sacrificed a tremendous amount and their families to be paying more for their health care and the benefits they were promised. So I think the way we get at this healthcare debate is to really look to what's happening in the civilian sector and to say, how do we provide better quality of care? Because actually, if you look at all the surveys on satisfaction with healthcare, it's quite uneven and actually below the civilian benchmark in terms of the quality of care that military personnel and their families can count on. So how do we get better quality of care through value-based health care and get better savings or lower cost in the process? This is being pioneered in the best areas of civilian health care, whether it's Kaiser or Cleveland Clinic or Stanford Medical. Those kinds of practices need to be brought into the military system or into the insurance system that the military used called TRICARE. And you could actually get better quality care and lower costs. So there's just, that's an example. There's a lot that can be done. Defense reform has always been this sort of afterthought,
Right.
but my argument is it's now becoming critical to actually freeing up the resources you're going to need to reinvest in the capabilities that will differentiate us 10 to 15 years from now.
Well, certainly with the cost trajectories that
Yeah.
August suggests. So, Michèle, when you were a couple of years ago as a senior fellow, you had a little working group with a lady, Tina, whose name
Tina
I
Zizek, yes.
Yeah. And you all were looking at sensible things to do in the defense budget, but not just sensible things to do, but what were the political obstacles and what were ways of overcoming them. Can you say just a word about, how you think about, as you say, if you look at health or if you look at acquisition, it's easy enough to say, or infrastructure, here's a problem, we should fix it. But you all were saying, why hasn't it been fixed already? So what are the obstacles, including political obstacles, and then how can we maybe jump over them?
Yeah. I mean, you could almost, one of the ways to think about, the reform agenda is very, very rich. I mean, it's a very target-rich environment, as they would say in DoD. And so you really have to decide what to go after. And I would almost sort of map it in a matrix where you envision, level of political difficulty on one axis and level of impact or benefit on the other axis. What the sweet spot is the high impact, more politically feasible stuff, which is not a highly populated quadrant in this matrix, but there are some things there. There are also some things that give you some benefit, not too hard politically, where you might get some quick wins and create some momentum. I think a lot of this gets back to this point of reestablishing a more productive partnership with Congress, and particularly the armed services and the defense appropriation leadership in Congress. Get them to, be partners and owners of this problem set and try to move things forward with you. If you try to sort of come up with all the solutions, in your own, the confines of your own world, and then you sort of spring it on Congress and expect them to love it, not a good recipe for having it work. So I think getting them in on the ground floor, helping them be authors and architects alongside you in trying to move some of this forward, and really explaining the risks of not doing this. The risks are substantial to our ability to defend ourselves and our interests as a nation in the medium to long term. We have the best military in the world today, there's no question, despite the rhetoric of the political campaign. But you can't just sit on your laurels. You have to work to maintain that over time.
Let me ask one more question and then say to the audience that we're going to the floor. There are 2 microphones on the ground floor, and there are 2 microphones in the loge. And if you'll line up, we'll do the questions. But we were talking also earlier, so if you go to a National Security Council meeting or to the deputies meeting, you have the problem of the day, or of the hour, maybe. And you start with like a snapshot, what the problem of Syria today, but we were talking about whether it would be, how would one imagine having somebody like a historian at the table, or as part of the process, who would say, the snapshot today is the point at which the movie that's been running for a year or a decade actually has arrived. So having some sense for the movie might help us understand the problem. Or similarly, you said, and how about somebody there who might even say, and once we solve this problem today, probably the movie will continue tomorrow, or maybe for a decade. So maybe we need somebody thinking about the future as well. So if you were trying to think about the design of a policy process to take more account of both the history of how we got here and the likely trajectories after we've intervened or attempted to impact things, how would you think about that?
The first thing is I would like to see sort of history have a seat at the table. I very much like the applied history project that you've started here. But the problem is too often we would come in, to a particular situation, and every once in a while you'd get a really, brilliant intelligence analyst who would know the history and who would weave the history into the intelligence briefing about the here and now. But it was sort of by exception. You couldn't count on that. And so there were many times where I felt I wanted to step back, even, for example, discussions of counterinsurgency strategy in Afghanistan. So we are doing the Afghanistan review, we're designing a new strategy, asking the questions, what do we know about the conditions under which counterinsurgency efforts succeed or fail? There's a fairly rich history on this that you would think should inform government decision-making, and yet there was not an easy way to bring that information to the table. We struggled with it and managed to do some of that, but it was almost despite the system, not because the system was sort of offering that up. So I think having access to a network of historians that were willing to do sort of, apply history to the current case, recognizing that you can draw the wrong lessons and you have to be careful about what lessons you draw. But I think that would be enormously helpful. On giving the future a seat at the table, it was a somewhat different question, which is the interagency process too often tends to be very crisis-driven. So something happens, the deputies come together to meet and start developing options for the principals and the president to consider. But it was a few months into my policy job where I realized I hadn't actually been to a meeting yet on China. And when you think about the role of China, that China is going to play as a partner, as a potential competitor, but as a major driving force in the Asia-Pacific region, the most important region to our prosperity and security long-term, kind of important issue. And I realized that the important was being squeezed out by the urgent. And so a couple of us got together and conspired to use our calendars to create a demand signal to give future thinking about, long-term thinking about where is China heading and what does it mean for the United States and what does it mean for the Department of Defense. So we started a quarterly deep dive at the 4-star level on a set of China topics and used our calendars to force the strategic to create space for the strategic thinking that would otherwise get crowded out by the crises of the day. So I think you have to structurally, whether it's setting aside time, setting aside staff, setting aside bandwidth, you have to work to create space for the future. Because otherwise it'll be outcompeted by the tyranny of your inbox.
Okay, I think that's a very imaginative wrinkle. So to say again, we're now open for questions. The microphones are here on the ground floor and on the lodge. And let me just take advantage. I see Dan Meridor here, who's visiting. Dan, how about you? Would we go to the microphone and make a small comment? Dan is visiting the Belfer Center as a senior fellow. He was the Deputy Prime Minister in Israel and Minister for Intelligence and many other similar jobs. But Dan, thank you.
Good evening. Good to see you, Michelle.
Good to see you.
Wishing the best for you, not to be specific. There seems to be a change in technology that changes the options. On one hand, you spoke of money. The money is exorbitant. On the other hand, rather than using huge armies and fleets as we used to do for years, the use of specific targeting, precision-guided weapons with very accurate and precise intelligence seem to maybe do the job with much less investment. It's a different thinking of getting the results. The old way, by the old convention, which was legitimate to kill a lot of people, soldiers, to get to the bunker of Hitler in Berlin, may not be needed now when you precisely can do it from afar. And there may be a way to save a lot of money at developing a strategy or a mode of action that maybe the United States is doing now, with using commandos, drones, not at big masses, but at specific targets. The targets need to be well chosen to be very significant. But this is maybe a new thinking of how you solve problems when you use force.
Okay.
Yeah.
What about?
I think this has very much been a trend in the American way of war, if you will, from deserts, from the Gulf War, all the way through to how the kinetic aspects of counterterrorism missions are being prosecuted today. So I think that trend is well established and is likely to continue. The thing I see now is that many of those technologies, which were uniquely in American hands for many years, gave us an advantage, are now proliferating. So we just put out a report called The World of Proliferated Drones. The number of countries that will have access to drones that can use precision munitions to strike targets is going to be in the dozens very, very soon. That's a different world to be operating in. So I also think it really depends, how far you can take the focus on precision and soft depends on what your, back to Clausewitz, what your fundamental political objectives are. If you have a situation where, for example, the North Korea attacked South Korea and we had a true war on the Korean Peninsula, that is going to involve, still, no matter how precise the technology, how advanced, that's going to involve armies, confronting one another in many cases to control territory and reestablish a government and so forth. So I think all I'm saying is there's a caveat. You can take this vision to the point where you assume away any need for land forces ever, and I think that in some scenarios that doesn't actually apply. But this is a trend that we have certainly advanced. The United States has advanced, but now we're going to be living in a world where, again, it's ubiquitous, and we're going to be confronting it, be on the other receiving end of it as well, which is a new set of challenges.
I'm waiting for the first drone to fly over the U.S. and shoot somebody and see how it works. But you can actually, with the drones that are commercially available, hook up your rifle to work with it. This lady is the first, please, and introduce yourself and then put your question.
Hi, my name is Sarah Plan. I'm a second-year PhD student at MIT Security Studies program, so thank you very much for your talk. My question is essentially, in a resource-tight environment, how do you suggest the Defense Department and the U.S. military balance between addressing conventional threats like Russia and China and unconventional or asymmetric terrorist threats like ISIL? Do you see any trade-offs between them, and how would those trade-offs play out?
I think that the most immediate threat that we face is from potential terrorist organizations who are trying to attack the United States or U.S. allies and interests abroad. But I think as we see the rise of a more, return of a more resurgent revisionist Russia, and the rise of a China who we hope will be a partner in some areas, but may well be a competitor and may choose not to play by the international rules of the road, as we are seeing the early signs of. I think those are much more challenging scenarios. But I would not bifurcate conventional versus unconventional in the way you have, in that I think what we saw in Crimea and Ukraine is the Russian military combining highly unconventional means with conventional means to this sort of hybrid form of warfare. So little green men, cyber attacks, propaganda, all kinds of unconventional means married with eventually conventional means. Same thing is more in the maritime and air domain in Asia. So I think what we're going to see is this blending of conventional and unconventional means in ways that, again, try to undermine our strengths and exploit our vulnerabilities. So we need to expect that not only from non-state actors, but from even high-end state actors that we're trying to deter.
Gentleman in the loge, please.
Hi, I'm Philip Balson. I'm a sophomore at the college. You talked about the importance of the United States maintaining a technological edge in order to be able to deter our adversaries going forward. In a constrained budget environment, how do you balance between technological edge on the one hand and readiness and force size on the other? And do you think it's worthwhile to pour more money into development or procurement without first reforming how that system works to make sure we don't have cost overruns?
Great questions. That is the golden triangle, or between readiness for current operations, the size of your force for future contingencies, and how much you modernize and invest in future capabilities. And I think that finding that balance has to be informed by a set of assumptions about the future scenarios that you might face and how you prioritize that, but also by our track record. I mean, my old boss, Robert Gates, used to say we have a very clear track record about predicting the future. Is we never get it right. And so whatever force you build, you have to make sure it really has its full spectrum. It has a lot of agility and flexibility to deal with the unanticipated and the unexpected. On your question about the acquisition system, I think that we should continue to try to reform the system to get better quality at cost, on schedule, and so forth. But I'm also coming to believe that when it comes to accessing commercial technology, bringing it in to the military, adapting it for military purposes, particularly IT-driven technologies, you can't use the same acquisition system. It has to turn on a completely different cycle. It requires different authorities. It requires different levels of risk tolerance, different incentives. So I'm coming to believe that you almost have to build a separate parallel system, a kind of different subculture for acquiring commercial and IT-driven technologies for the military than the system you use to procure a fleet of aircraft carriers over 20 years or a fleet of fifth-generation fighter jets.
So that's a very big idea, and Michèle has been noodling it
And we
for
have a
some time.
CNAS report coming out saying how
Oh.
to do this, so
Okay.
stay tuned.
This gentleman.
Hi, I'm a first-year international student from Iraq, and my question is: ever since 2003, the tensions between different constituents of the Iraqi population have been rising exponentially, and I guess my question is, how should they've risen so much that some constituents are looking for outside allies such as Iran or Turkey, and with such a polarization, and for example, the Turkish Prime Minister saying that Turkey has some claim to northern Iraq, how should the U.S. Approach the different tensions between the constituents of its allies and the different tensions between its own allies, such as Turkey and Iraq?
Yeah, I think you've put your finger on the hardest problem in Iraq, which is that the sectarian divisions and the rise in tension that you described is part of what created that reopened the door for a group like the Islamic State, which, the remnants of Al-Qaeda in Iraq, who had gone to Syria in exile, to come back in and find some support in the Sunni population, because the Sunni population had become, felt very marginalized by the Iraqi government, felt even persecuted, and so forth. And so we have to use what leverage we have diplomatically to try to get the Iraqi central government, which is now Shia-dominated, to recognize that they really are at a crossroads. If they continue down the road of increasingly sectarian governance, they will see a fracturing of the Iraqi state. You will have the Sunnis defect. You will have the Kurds sue for independence, which will create all kinds of other ripple effects with Kurdish populations in other parts of the region. That's one path. The other path, keeping Iraq together, will require some degree of compromise, perhaps a more federated system, perhaps with some devolution of more power and authority to local populations in some areas. But unless the Iraqi central government finds its way to do that, I think it's very hard to envision the Iraqi state holding. I think the U.S. diplomacy has to help them understand that. And I know we've been trying. I think the administration has made huge efforts in this regard. But I think what's going to be happening in the wake of Mosul and so forth is going to bring this into relief. And I hope that we can help the key constituents in the Iraqi government see that they really are at a crossroads in terms of keeping their country together.
Okay. This gentleman, please.
Good evening, ma'am. My name is Steve. I'm a former Marine, currently a second-year graduate student here at the Kennedy School. And my question is about the civilian-military divide. I'm sure you're well aware, the divide is one that continues to grow and has a strong impact on our society. And for those in the room, just to understand that impact, is that currently less than 1% of eligible civilians serve in the armed forces. Approximately 80% of those who serve come from immediate family members that have also served. And approximately 50% of active duty are concentrated in about 5 states. These concentrated pools that are small amounts in our country do not represent a good cross-section of our American society. And on top of that, about 18% of those who serve in Congress served in the military, yet they're the ones that are making our national security policy. So my question to you is, what is your assessment of the civilian-military divide and its impact on America? And what policy prescriptions do you think are best for that?
Yeah.
Good question.
Well, I think it's a very important question, particularly in a democracy. You want your all-volunteer force to be representative of America, to look like America, to be connected to America. I think there are several things that need to, some people would say we need to return to a draft. I personally don't think that's the right answer. I don't think it would produce the kind of military we need today. But I do think there are ways to try to make service more attractive to a broader range of folks. Part of it is, I do think there's a very valuable role that our Guard and Reserve play, because they really widen the connection to a much broader range of communities. I think that where the military recruits is very important, and trying to consciously double down on recruiting outside areas of traditional recruiting strength. My son happens to be at the Naval Academy now. The number of people at a Bethesda, Maryland high school who go into the military service is like, and the number of people who came up and said, "Why are you joining the military? What is that about?" I mean, it was like, just the fact of his choosing has created a whole conversation in his high school about, oh, military service, nobody's thought about that. And so I think getting out into places where it's not typical or may even be unknown is really, really important. So there's no easy answer. The last thing I'll say is I'm personally very supportive of creating more national service opportunities writ large, not so that the primary or only path to service is not just the military, but there are all kinds of different ways to serve. Every year, we turn away tens of thousands of young people from Teach for America, from AmeriCorps, and so forth. It would be wonderful to have a national expectation of citizenship that, part of what we do is we serve for a couple of years on our way to whatever career that we're going to have. Stan McChrystal and others have been very involved in pushing this. I think that also would raise a dialogue that might also help attract more people into military service. But no easy answers, but it's a really important point for the health of our democracy, I think, over time.
Thank you.
This gentleman then, please.
Nice to meet you in person. My honor. I'm coming from South Korea. I'm retired military general and attending the master degree course here. I want to ask about my country. Since the fifth nuclear test, there are a lot of sense of urgency in Korean society. And many people raise their voice about more additional viable policy to inhibit Kim Jong-un's nuclear ambitions. But in some way or another, we failed to stop their nuclear proliferation ambitions. And in your assessment, what kind of policy coordination would be required to actually stop Kim Jong-un's nuclear ambitions?
Yeah. So the question is, how do we try to stop Kim Jong-un's nuclear ambitions? I just came back from a week in Korea, so we had a lot of discussions on this point. I think it has to be a multi-pronged effort. First of all, I do think that we need to put more pressure on, we have to increase the costs to Kim Jong-un for he's conducted 5 nuclear tests, he's conducted 23 missile tests this year alone. He's on a very provocative path. I think the primary way to do that is by trying to get China to put more pressure. China is the primary trading partner of North Korea, the primary energy supplier, and the primary political protector. So working with China, seeing if we can try to put more pressure on North Korea is important. The second thing is, in the meantime, the US and South Korea have to do more to make sure that South Korea and others in the region, Japan has been having these missiles land in their waters, that they are well defended, and that may mean improving missile defense and so forth. The third is to think about, to ensure that people really understand and believe the credibility of the U.S. extended deterrence guarantee to South Korea and to Japan in particular. The last thing we want is this crisis to cause broader nuclear proliferation in the region. I think that, eventually it would be, one would like to see us back at the negotiating table to try to constrain the nuclear program in the North, but this particular regime has shown no interest in that at this point. That's why I believe that some additional measures like sanctions, more targeted and more robust sanctions, need to be put in place to try to bring them back to the table seriously.
The gentleman in the lodge.
Good evening, ma'am. Recently, the New York Times published a piece on lethal autonomous weapon systems and their development within the Pentagon, calling it the Terminator conundrum, and arguing that the debate is now how much autonomy and how much independence should these machines be given to kill. What does meaningful human control mean to you, and do you think it's possible to constantly have a human in the loop within a man-machine team as these fights with our near-peer competitors move to machine speed?
Yeah, I have a hard time envisioning the U.S., the President of the United States deciding to have fully autonomous systems that are capable of killing. I think there will be a human in the loop whenever that is in play. The question is setting the parameters in which that happens. There will be parameters under which you automate certain functions. So, you have an approved target, you have, the sensor information, all of the feedback indicates that is the target, it's authorized, it's been approved, okay, you can, the system can execute that. But the notion of weapon systems sort of hunting out targets by themselves, on a mass scale without a human in the loop, I mean, that is the stuff of science fiction. There may be other countries, including potential adversaries, that choose to go down that path. I have trouble envisioning that as being a policy choice or a moral choice of a democratically governed country like the United States of America. So the question is, how much do we automate, and where does that human in the loop sort of check insert itself? And I think it's the details of those designs and those concepts of operation that will be very, very important. So I think the article got the debate right. It implied that we were going down the road towards a Terminator force in a way that I don't think is actually going to happen, at least in the United States.
Gentleman in the lodge.
Thank you very much. My name is Ali Wine. I'm a second-year Master in Public Policy student here. I was wondering if you might speak a little bit about the relationship or the relations between the United States and the Philippines, and in particular, if you think that the current Filipino president's seeming break with America and embrace of China is kind of a storm that will pass, or whether it's actually symptomatic of a more fundamental shift in the relationship, and if it's the latter, how, if at all, should the United States rethink its rebalance to the region?
It's a great question. I think that we have gone through periods like this in our relationship with the Philippines before. On the one hand, China has become the predominant trading partner with the Philippines. We are their second largest trading partner. We have been the predominant security partner. So I think the Philippine president is trying out a new policy. My own guess is that it will not be as successful in winning concessions from China as he hopes it will be. And I also think it won't be popular in the long term with his public. If you poll the Filipino public, they're very supportive of the U.S. security relationship. They don't want to be abandoned by the United States. They don't want to be there on their own without the United States. They don't want to be at risk of coercion from a very powerful China. So I think this situation will likely right itself over time, but it is one of those bumpy chapters that we'll have to navigate our way through over the coming months.
So Michelle and a group of us were discussing this earlier today. I would say it's a great question and it's a great answer, but I'm a little more pessimistic about it. I think it'll be interesting to watch over time. I think actually from a U.S. perspective, it's worth asking in what respects are the Philippines an asset, and in what respects are they a liability? So I think this topic will stay live for some time. This gentleman.
Good evening, Madam Brian Coyne, National Security Fellow here at Harvard. In light of much of the conversation tonight and myriad challenges facing our country, both near-term and long-term for our country, I'm interested in your thoughts on the feasibility of United States national grand strategy. And assuming you think it's feasible, how might you go about recommending the United States build one? Thank you.
So I do think it's not only feasible, it's desirable for the United States to have a grand strategy, a sense of vision of where are we trying to go in the world, how are we going to use our leadership, what are we trying to achieve, without the hubris of believing that we have the pen to write the history of other regions in the world. So I think, I guess I'm in the Eisenhower school on this, where he used to say, you know, it's not the plans, it's the planning. I think the value of developing a grand strategy is not so much the bumper sticker of, you know, containment for Cold War, or whatever it would be now that you come up with, or the document that sits, like, you know, the glossy document that sits on the coffee table. It is the process, the disciplined process of forcing yourself to think through your objectives, you know, your interests, your objectives, trade-offs, priorities, and the most important part of strategy, which we love to skip, is where are you going to accept and manage risk? What can you not do? What are you going to deprioritize? What are you going to live with the fact that you're not going to be able to solve it, you're going to have to try to manage it? So I think it's very useful to try and to go through a disciplined process. I think it has to be a top-down, leader-driven process, not a big bureaucratic exercise with thousands and thousands of people participating, bottom up. So that's what I would say. But you're talking to someone who used to run a strategy office, so I'm biased on the importance of strategy.
but who, in her reference to the bottom-up, will remember that, in the Clinton administration, she ran the bottom-up review.
Yes.
Or played a big part in running it.
Right.
This gentleman, please.
Hello, ma'am. Thank you for joining us. Master's graduate of Northeastern University, International Relations. Now that we're well over a decade into our involvement in Iraq and Afghanistan, there's been an increased discussion from many of whom I believe are your colleagues at the Defense Department about the need for increased cultural awareness in the military. I'm curious to see whether you believe that should be a priority for the coming administration and future DoD officials.
Can I ask you to clarify, when you say cultural awareness, you mean primarily vis-a-vis when we are understanding the people we're operating on the ground with, or more, are you making more of the history point?
Yes, ma'am, those that we're operating on ground with.
Okay. I think it's very important. The question is how you do it and how you develop it quickly, especially if you're in a world where you may find yourself not fighting the conflicts you thought you were prepared for, but fighting someplace that you weren't expecting. I think that one of the challenges we've faced in both Iraq and Afghanistan and elsewhere is an inadequate understanding of our partners and of the cultural context and the societal context into which we were inserting ourselves. And that has been further undermined by the fact that we have a rotational policy with our military leaders and troops that is very understandable and in many ways necessary from a force management perspective. But from a really understanding the situation, building relationships, transforming the situation on the ground perspective means that we're having a series of 1 year, 9 month or 1 year chapters. in an operation rather than something sustained over time. So it is a challenge. It's not easily solved, but I think an awareness of it and a priority to really get that understanding early, to draw on the tremendous diversity of our own population, finding people who are Americans who have some understanding of those cultures, have some connection to those cultures, and can give us a starting point. Drawing on our academic resources, all of that is very, very important. But you're right, this is a lesson we keep relearning, and it's very important to figure out how to do better in the future.
So please, in the loge.
Yep. Good evening, ma'am. Given your background working within the government and centers, this is my question. Do you feel we have sufficient cross-pollination between those working as DoD cyber operators and those with the think tanks? In particular, I'm a temporary fellow for about 4 weeks with the Belfer Center, and it's been an immensely beneficial experience hearing the other side, and then also giving a little bit more pragmatic and insight to the discussions when big thoughts are given at the table to say, well, here's why this may or may not be practical. So for me, it's been an experience, but I'm more like at the action officer level within your background. So do you feel, given that in your experience, that there has been sufficient cross-pollination, or do you envision more?
Absolutely not sufficient. I mean, I think you are in a soda straw. You are a very, one of a very small number of people who are moving between the government, the think tank world, and I would include also the tech community. And one of the things that we're going to have to do as a nation to get on top of the cyber set of challenges is to go from a soda straw to a superhighway of talent that is moving between the tech sector, the government sector, and the academic and sort of policy influencing world. There are ways to do that. One of the things we were kicking around earlier was, an idea of cyber ROTC. Why don't we pay for people to get their university training in cyber relevant fields and then ask them to do a period of service in the government before they go off to Google or Facebook or whatever. And then once they're in the tech sector, why don't we create very attractive ways for them to serve their country for 2 or 3 years as a fellow in government, as part of the US Digital Service, for example, which again, wonderful idea, tiny, 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 needs to be grown enormously. And similarly, fellowships like the one you're on. There should be thousands of you, not just one of you, right? So I think it's really expanding those opportunities going to be key to getting the policy tech dialogue we need and also the human capital flow we need between the private sector and government.
The gentleman in the loge.
Good evening, ma'am. My name is Gabe Gladstein. I'm a junior at the Harvard College and an ROTC cadet. I'm wondering where you think the point is in a humanitarian crisis at which the U.S. is morally obligated to intervene.
It's a very good question, and it gets to this notion of the responsibility to protect. And I think for the international community, and the U.S. has been part of this dialogue, the line has been drawn at the point when genocide is occurring, certainly. That is a point at which intervention is obligated or expected. I think that dialogue very much came out of the experience in Rwanda. I think it's an open question as to whether what we're seeing right now in Aleppo actually meets that. What we are seeing certainly is the wholesale slaughter of a civilian population as part of a determined and deliberate military operation on the part of the Assad regime and backed by the Russian Air Force.
This gentleman, please.
Good evening, ma'am. My name is Dan Crenshaw. I'm a graduate student here at the Kennedy School and a military vet. My question is on the future of U.S. strategy with respect to Iran. Whether we like the JCPOA or the Iran deal, we can probably agree it bought us some time. My question is what we do at that time. And in 10 to 15 years, these provisions of the JCPOA will expire. As it looks right now, it doesn't seem likely that Iranian behavior in the region will change much. and we might again find ourselves at a crossroads in the next 10 to 15 years. What should we do at that time in order to ensure that U.S. leverage is still strong when we find ourselves at that crossroads?
Right. Now, I would agree that whether or not you like the Iran deal, it did put time on the clock, and it basically, you know, keeps the Iranian nuclear program sort of at a certain point where they can't dash to a nuclear weapon in a short amount of time, you know, for a period of 10 to 15 years. But the nuclear file is not the only aspect of Iranian behavior that's been concerning. It was the most acute and most important to address initially. But they continue to support terrorist groups in the region. They continue to play very unhelpful roles in Iraq, in Yemen, in Syria, as we're seeing. And I think the United States, as part of a broader coalition, needs to push back on that behavior and to hold them accountable when they violate, for example, ballistic missile, UN resolutions with regard to ballistic missile activities. They need to be concerned about sanctions there and so forth. So I do think we need to both maintain the deal, but also push back on their nefarious behavior when it exists. And, but also, you know, at the same time, not, you know, try to keep an open channel with Iran so that if someday the Iranian people choose to have a different kind of regime, we have a basis for communication and dialogue and so forth. That said, I don't think we should have, you know, wishful thinking about the nature of the regime today.
So unfortunately, we have 3 minutes left and we have 3 questions. So they'll have to be short questions. I'm going to let you each ask them very quickly, and then Michelle will do what she can to answer 1 or 2 of them. This gentleman is next.
Okay. And look at that name, JFK. I came in the state from Italy a long time ago. I became member of the parliament. I was in faculty at Harvard, Stanford, many places, in Russia. I'm an academician in Russia, in Japan. And see, I hear a different story. But you don't understand that, you know, without a peaceful world, we go nowhere. You understand the Russian has the capability to destroy the United States and the world tomorrow morning, and the Russian knows it, and I saw it, and the United States could have done it many years ago. So I think, I recall 3, you gave me, I was going to try to talk with you because I moved back to the States now, because in Italy, in all this age limit, you know, in anything you do. Not here, thanks God, you know, so I came back. But you know, thorium, I was a nuclear physicist at the beginning of my life. My advisor terminated his job because at the point, people made illegal to produce nuclear reactor with thorium rather than with uranium. Uranium will create 3 Mile Island, will create disaster, will be terrible. I mean, no future for humanity, okay? Thorium is a reality. Thanks God, some country, India, there's nobody from India, will create thorium reactor very shortly. No possibility to have plutonium, no bomb. The reason because, you know, the USA government at that time, after the killing of JFK, because JFK was killed by the same guy who killed in Russia, Boris Nemtsov, the same type of people. Okay, the same type of people wants us to speak about these things, to play war. So I think humanity has pending over its head something which is called asteroids. Okay, something called uranium, calling, you know, we are losing energy. I don't understand, we're talking about nothing, and we're forgetting where we live. We need to work together with everybody from Japan, from Russia. You play in the interest of a man like Putin. He wants to play this.
Okay, so excuse me.
You play the game he wants to play.
So thank you. This gentleman, again, please briefly, yes?
Ma'am, what do you see as the future of U.S. Space policy as space becomes a contested domain in the 21st century? Thank you.
And this lady, the last question.
Think about building up our deterrence in the cyber realm and particularly developing an offensive strategy when the actions we could take might set norms for the larger international community.
Okay. I think what we've demonstrated is that she has to come back. But Michelle, say what you can about any one of them briefly. Yes?
Well, you know, I think that everyone in this room shares the objective of a more peaceful world. But I believe that there are certain challenges and threats that we have to meet with a credible deterrent to try to achieve that more peaceful world. So, and I also think we should always keep the channels for dialogue open, even as we ensure that our deterrence is credible and so forth. On the question of space, you're right, it's becoming more congested as a domain, more contested. It is absolutely integral not only to our military, but also to just about everything we rely on, from our phones to our GPS to everything we rely on in our civilian lives and as a civilian economy. So I think there has to be a lot more attention paid to trying to reinforce some norms of behavior and to have open discussions with other major players on this issue. I think there are ways in which you can create some elements of deterrence in space in terms of trying to keep certain types of behavior that someone might, an adversary might be tempted to try to keep that off limits by saying, you really don't want to go there because the cost to you will be too great. And I think that part of the answer, though, is really building a much more resilient approach. And I personally really applaud the commercialization of space that we're seeing, everything from the ability to send human beings into space to the launch capacity and so forth, because I think that will, first of all, greatly complicate the challenge for anybody who wants to think about aggression in the domain, but it will also greatly enhance our resilience should that ever happen. On cyber, I'll just say that I think the policy and the sort of conceptual thinking is way behind the development of the tools. So we have some fairly exquisite tools, and we have not yet caught up in terms of thinking through our policies and constraints and approaches for how to use them. We have not thought through notions of, can there be deterrence in cyberspace? Can there be escalation control in cyberspace? These are notions that we're sort of importing from traditional defense, the lexicon, and particularly thinking about the nuclear domain, but they don't necessarily apply very well once you get into the details in cyber. And so I think talk about a really rich area for a place like the Kennedy School to dive into, helping to close that gap conceptually, helping to make sure we have a cadre of next generation leaders who understand both the technology and the policy, because right now those are very different sets of people that don't really understand much about what each other is saying or doing. So I think that's very, very, very important.
So sadly, we've come to the witching hour. Let me say again how proud we are of Michèle, how glad we are she spent the evening with us, how much we look forward to having her back.
Great, thank you. Thanks very much.